Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness, a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today we'll be speaking with Matt Collins. He is a Christian apologist and a student of the Shroud. We'll be talking about Christian apologetics and how it relates to the Shroud of Turin, and also a really big thing that he's put together. And Matt, you've started almost a whole new ministry. So let me tell you a little bit about Matt. He's a native of Georgia for the last 57 years, a UGA, Go Dogs, BBA, 1988 on entrepreneurship. He's worked in many different fields in hospital administration, financial consulting, but recently he's made some really big investments in the study of the Shroud of Turin. And lastly, he's a member of the Trinity Church in Sharpsburg, Georgia. Matt, welcome.
Thanks for having me back, Guy. I've been thrilled to be on your podcast, and I love watching the episodes. You've had some terrific people on, and I just appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. So we've already talked a little bit about what your backstory is on the Shroud, but tell us a little bit about that. But more importantly, the new thing that you want to talk about and what you're showing us today, and we'll have a couple of videos on that separately from the podcast. But go ahead, take over.
So, the first episode we had, we talked about what I was doing, and today we wanted to show everyone the sculpture that was created here in Atlanta just recently. And there really aren't all that many people that have seen it, but I know that that the podcast here, the show here, is going to be a great way to unveil the sculpture of Jesus Christ, exactly how he looked, based on the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and you're right. We are going to be, I guess, unveiling it for the first time to the rest of the world. So thank you for the honor of allowing me to do that with you.
Well, we're thrilled to work together on this, and it's such an important project. There's a lot of work to be done. And the work, of course, is involving helping anybody get to heaven.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you did is you commissioned a sculpture of what we believe as Shroudists, what we believe Jesus Christ may have looked like. What brought you to actually commissioning the work of building that sculpture?
Well, it's hard to explain other than the most simple explanation, which is God put me up to it. I can't say that there was any one particular, the idea was put in my head. And there was a lot of clarity involved as to how to go about doing it. And I was just so fortunate to be able to hire a guy like Martin Dow here in Atlanta, who is a very famous artist, to take on the project. And the end result has been beyond my wildest expectations.
Yeah, it really is truly something that is past your expectations, certainly past mine. I'm very amazed, and so tell us some of the decisions you had to make as you were building and having the building of the sculpture being done.
Well, we used the imagery from the Shroud. One thing that's very important for people to understand is that without the Shroud of Turin, there would be no sculpture. And this isn't the only sculpture of Christ ever made from the Shroud. The other two that I know of are in Turin, Italy. But it's not like an artist just came up with this image of Christ. It was extracted from the Shroud of Turin, and the sculpture is an apologetic for the Shroud itself. And that's what I want to leave people with today, is so they understand that it didn't just come out of thin air. It came from the Shroud.
Yeah. So you said it's now an apologetic for the Shroud. What exactly do you mean by that?
What it means is that the sculpture and the Shroud corroborate the Gospels. A lot of people that are Shroudies think of the Shroud of Turin as the first Gospel, because it was, we believe that it was created during the resurrection. And the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written a couple of decades later. So the first evidence of the resurrection, if you believe the shroud is authentic, and of course we do, is the shroud. And we were able to take through the use of a computer, we're able to take the image that's on the shroud and create a 3D image. And that 3D image is what my sculptor used to build a life-size sculpture of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So for anyone that wants to an idea of what Jesus looked like in real life, we've got it. And what I'm doing with it is, I'm a public speaker, and I like to show people the sculpture. And what we want to do is visit as many churches as possible and show them and talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting, so Christianity is defined by the resurrection. And, obviously, certainly Jesus' teachings, but really it was the resurrection that is the defining moment in Christianity. The shroud is what is believed to be the witness, the only witness of that instant. And then what you've done as building them this sculpture is you now have an apologetic for the shroud, which is the witness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Well, the only problem with the shroud is that the image is faint. And so if you were fortunate enough to see it in Turin, which isn't very often, they don't display it very often, and of course it's in a glass case, it's hard to actually make out much from it. The slides that public speakers use, the negative from the image, of course you can make out the image very clearly, but a sculpture is a lot better image than what you see on a slide. And people are moved by it, and I think it's a very important way. We've broken new ground, I believe, in explaining the shroud. Again, that you can't have the sculpture without the shroud, and but people are visual, and people have been. The feedback has been very, very positive for the few people that have seen it.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for allowing me to be one of the first, and I am just absolutely amazed. It's interesting when you talk about, though, the shroud as being potentially an image of Jesus, and then you have the sculpture, which is now a 3D image of Jesus, and yet some people like John Calvin back in the Reformation in the early Protestant church days actually wanted to remove images out of the church. So what do you think about the shroud and then, of course, the sculpture as being potentially what you would call a graven image?
Well, that's a minority view, and certainly Calvinists are a minority. They certainly think that would view the Shroud of Turin itself and my sculpture as something that would be a violation of the Second Commandment. I think most people don't think of it that way, either the shroud or my sculpture. I hope not. And I would say this, that we don't, you and I in particular, I'm pretty sure we don't worship the Shroud of Turin. And I don't expect anybody to worship the sculpture that I created of Jesus Christ. We worship the person that those two things represent. And that's a big difference, in my opinion. And honestly, as far as a commandment, I don't think we violate the Second Commandment. And I would answer that question with this question. I would say, is it sinful to be dismissive of the shroud when there's a very good chance that it was the burial cloth of Jesus, and there's a very good chance that it was a receipt that God left us for the resurrection. And as you said, the resurrection is the seminal event of our faith. And Paul said, if Christ didn't rise, then we don't have any hope. And he did rise, and we've got a lot of hope. And a sculpture that helps drive home that point is something that I thought was something that needed to be done.
And I think that makes a lot of sense, although I think I've seen it as well, and I know you have. Some pastors and preachers are less than enthusiastic about the shroud. Why do you think that is?
Well, let me say this. A pastor or any person that speaks publicly about Christianity for a living, is their thought process isn't exactly the same as the typical congregant of either Catholic or Protestant church. I think a lot of Christians are very receptive to the shroud. I hope they'll be very receptive to my sculpture. I think that there are millions of shroudies in the world. A shroudie is someone that thinks that the Shroud of Turin is probably authentic. And I'm certainly one of those, or I wouldn't have gone to the expense and effort to create the sculpture. But pastors have to think differently than that. They're shepherds of their flock, and honestly, they're risk averse, and a lot of them really don't know that much about the Shroud of Turin. I've found that out myself. They haven't drilled down. A lot of them don't really care one way or the other. I spent a long time talking to a good friend of mine who has been a Protestant pastor for 30 years, and I showed him the sculpture, and he said he was actually blown away by the sculpture. And he said, Matt, I'm not a shroud enthusiast. I don't know all that much about it, and really don't care. And he said that, but pastors in general are not going to view, many of them don't view the shroud as, in his terminology, his phraseology, a hill to die on. That's not, they don't want to stick their neck out for something that they think might not be authentic, because there have been other things that have been out there that have been presented as authentic that maybe haven't been authentic. And what I told him was something that I thought was a good response to that. I said, you're totally, completely right. But because the resurrection is so important and central to our faith, that we need to remember that the hill to die on is Calvary. And what we've done in promoting the Shroud of Turin and creating a sculpture on my part is to highlight that event. That is the most important thing in our lives. Our salvation depends on the resurrection. And I think that the sculpture does a nice job of highlighting what happened to Jesus. He was executed and nailed up to a cross, and it's hard to deny that happened when you see the sculpture.
Mm. Well, to your point about the teaching of faith and then the resurrection, certainly I think we all, including pastors, that might doubt the shroud or might not necessarily, maybe endorse isn't the right term, but promote it in a way as being a part of the faith. Certainly they are promoting resurrection, no question about it. Easter Sunday, Good Friday, the suffering, the passion, everything related to that is so important and taught so well. And then, but the other thing though that is interesting is that it to some extent it's the culmination of all the Gospels. And the pastors and preachers and priests, they're teaching also all of that culmination up to that seminal moment of Easter Sunday and the resurrection and the empty tomb. And one of the things though that I find is really fascinating is how you have, with the sculpture, have corroborated so much that's in the four Gospels about the resurrection. Tell us a little bit about what you've done there.
Well, it's important to understand that the shroud and the sculpture corroborate the other four Gospels. Remember, we were talking earlier that some people believe that the Shroud of Turin is the first Gospel because it documents, if it's authentic, and there's a very good chance that it is, that it actually documents the resurrection and is a receipt, so to speak, for the resurrection. And when I get up in front of a crowd, I don't say that there's 100% chance that the shroud is authentic, but because nobody could ever prove that 100%. But I do think that it is. If you think about it, it's kind of sinful to be dismissive of something that is proof of the resurrection, if it is authentic. And if God left us that, then if we're dismissive of it, I think that in itself is sinful. That's just my personal opinion, and I think that pastors maybe that are on the fence ought to at least give their congregants the opportunity to make up their minds for themselves, and because a pastor thinks differently than they do on this particular point, they have to be risk averse, but they view the shroud as risky, and in some ways, and not all of them, but some do, and I would love to speak to the ones that are maybe don't have an opinion one way or the other, but want to help people make up their own mind, because you and I certainly believe, and I think that it is authentic, and it might be.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with that. I mean, there is no such thing as certainty, and but the resurrection is certain. But being 100% certain that the shroud is the true image of the resurrection, who knows? There could be a couple of things that might come out that would prove that it's false. I don't believe that necessarily, and I'm in the 99.9% sure that it is.
Let me say this. I don't think many people know all that much about the particulars of the shroud. I think that a lot of people, a lot of churchgoers have an impression, a gut feeling, and I don't blame them for having a gut. It's easy, I think, to have a gut feeling that it's authentic. You and I know that for someone, an artist, a medieval artist, to have come up with the imagery, to have painted on the imagery of the shroud is kind of ridiculous. It is. But a lot of people that are skeptics of the shroud haven't drilled down on any of those reasons. And they certainly don't. Most of them have no idea that 33 scientists in 1978 studied the shroud for 5 days and left with more questions than they had when they got there. They were there to discern whether or not the imagery was applied by a human, and the answer is no. And the carbon-14 dating that came a decade later did not convince those 33 scientists that it was some kind of fraud. There's no explanation for the image that's on the shroud in terms of. They can't explain it. It's a paper-thin image. It was not painted on there. Nobody could have painted that on there. It's that when you really give it a lot of thought, it's kind of ridiculous.
Well, and secondly, too, you also showed the Scenarium, which is the face cloth that was applied around Jesus' head right before he was brought to the tomb. And it's interesting, they carbon dated both of the shroud and the face cloth, and both of them have different dates. And yet there are so many pieces of corroboration between both items, with the blood stains and the markings and other things, that one actually corroborates the other. And if that's true, then that uncorroborates the carbon-14 testing that was done on both of them.
Well, I think that one thing that I hope to clear up when I speak to groups is that people don't understand that they're two separate cloths. That the Scenarium, which was put over Jesus' face when he was still on the cross, is not the same as the Shroud of Turin. There's no image of Christ on the Scenarium. there certainly, of course, is on the Shroud of Turin. And I think that I've found that people don't understand that, and I hope to help to clear that up some. That because clearing that up and showing the replica that I have of the Scenarium, the face cloth, and the shroud can, I think, clear up for people when they read the scriptures, in particular John, that the shroud does corroborate John and the other gospels. Mm-hmm. And without that corroboration, I wouldn't personally be as excited as I am about it. But they do corroborate each other.
Yeah, and I think that's an enormous point with the shroud, the face cloth, and the gospels, and I like your point too about the shroud being the first gospel. It's kind of a historical, not written, but certainly an image that really shows what probably happened, during the resurrection, and certainly the evidence of the passion. And each one of the points on that shroud corroborate exactly what's written in the following four gospels, which were written, like you said, decades later. I think
it's sinful to be. This is just a personal opinion, of course. I think it's sinful to be dismissive of it. We're certainly not dismissive of the other four gospels, and that certainly would be sinful.
Yeah.
I get it that pastors, in particular, many of them, are skeptical and don't want to stick their neck out for something that might be not authentic. I can understand that. Mm-hmm. I just would make an appeal to them to let people decide for themselves.
Yeah, yeah. So anything else you want to bring up today that we haven't covered?
No, I think I've been reading your book, and I just really think that what you've done here with the podcast was very, very needed, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the promoting the Shroud, and I hope that I've been able to break some new ground. And I would love to speak to anybody that wants to hear me speak about and show the sculpture. I'm mobile. I carry around the sculpture in my car. I have the body in my car. And
so you get to drive the HOV lane.
That's right. That's right.
Who could say he's not a living sculpture?
That's right. I can also, and I've been asked if people can rent the sculpture, and that I can certainly work with somebody on that. I don't have to be a speaker at an event. They might want, there might be a church that wants to display the sculpture for a week or so and have an exhibit. Because I've got other pieces of the puzzle. I've got the Roman flagrum. I've got, of course, the replicas of the Shroud that we've seen in the videos, and other things that would make it a resurrection exhibit, so to speak. And the point of an exhibit would be to have it for more than one day and to have as many people come in and view it as possible. And certainly can be an attraction to get people in the church. Mm.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think certainly in terms of what it's able to show and be able to bring to people that are, that are Christians, to be able to see that, yes, those gospels are true, and here is then what came out of it, and here's then exactly what Jesus suffered during that passion. And there's the Shroud is the proof of that.
If one person sees the sculpture or sees an exhibit with all the other things that I have in it, if one person is moved by that to strengthen their faith because of seeing it, then mission accomplished.
I agree with that 100%. My book, I've written it exactly for that reason. If I can bring just one person to Christ, I will have succeeded. So, Matt, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. We are going to have a number of different videos of all of the different materials that Matt has put together. He has a replica of the Shroud. He has a replica of the face cloth, the Scenarium of Oviedo. And then lastly, of course, the pièce de résistance. He has a sculpture that is based directly from the image that's seen on the Shroud. Matt, thank you so much, and hopefully you and I together in some fashion, in some way, we will bring people to Christ through what we're doing. Thank you again.
Thanks again, Guy.